many of you know that I've always prided myself on my ability to avoid having any more than just a very few friends. Alas, I seem to have failed in that regard. So, Jarrett, I think we may now begin, yes?
The Caretaker by Doon Arbus. It was the last of its kind, saved from extinction, not by any intrinsic Darwinian attribute, but by the whims of chance. It had survived the sudden recent influx of bulldozers and cranes and construction crews that had done away with its original neighbors, leaving in their wake a motley assortment of competing ambitions. Faceted tiers of glass in the shape of a defunct wedding cake, reflecting fragments of cloud back at the sky. Windowless cement bunkers for exhibiting art, a rose-colored ziggurat, and a pair of as yet unoccupied leaning towers. This bombastically revitalized environment imposed upon the lone survivor, an unprepossessing three-story red brick building, a look of baffled stoicism. In the absence of any noteworthy architectural feature to justify its continued existence in the face of all this change, it squatted there, stubbornly on its bit of turf, a dwarfed, defiant anachronism.
If you were raised on the classics and have come to believe in fate, you might say that the Caretaker's fate embraced him 25 years earlier on a chilly winter evening in a rooming house in Prague when, bending over a stack of discarded English language newspapers waiting to be crumpled into fuel, he chanced upon the following headline: Dr. Charles A. Morgan, chemist, author, philosopher, and collector, dies at 66. News of the death of an intimate could not have been more shattering to his sense of equilibrium. In his student days, he had encountered his intellectual lodestar in Morgan's seminal volume, Stuff, an experience that marked him forever. He discovered in the book many of his own inchoate thoughts expressed in the words of a kindred spirit. In fact, such an affinity existed between the writer's psyche and his own that it often seemed as if a sentence on the page and its echo in his mind had sprung into being simultaneously, leaving him incapable of distinguishing the conjurer from the conjured. The book had become, in a sense, his Bible. It accompanied him everywhere. Although his relationship to its author was, of course, entirely one-sided, it remained nonetheless solely responsible for his feeling less alone in the world.
Although he died unexpectedly, alone and far from home, among strangers whose language he neither spoke nor understood, Dr. Morgan died prepared. In choosing his wife to preside over his legacy, he had chosen well. His death had an immediate salutary effect upon his new widow's regard and affection for him, reviving in her feelings that had been quashed by her exposure to the harsh daily realities of his nature. As a memory, he achieved absolution in her eyes. The metamorphosis enabled her to forgive his transgressions and to regard even his most abrasive habits as mere harmless eccentricities. His absence healed the rift. When the Caretaker first accepted the position at the Morgan Foundation and promised them 5 years, he may have envisioned it as little more than the latest in a continuing series of respites from his own life. He must have relished the prospect of inhabiting this sanctuary, one he had never even anticipated visiting other than in his imagination. A sanctuary, however temporary, in which to polish someone else's silver, to house rare manuscripts in plastic sleeves, to rehabilitate a broken stool or damaged artifact, to replace labels for displays, to wrest order from disorder, and to share with strangers to whatever degree his eloquence permitted, his hard-won understanding of the meaning of Dr. Morgan's singular achievement. On several occasions in the course of the ensuing 24 years, he had tendered his resignation only to be persuaded to withdraw it each time, inadvertently securing in the process salary increases to which he remained indifferent, and binding himself in exchange to additional ever-lengthening terms of commitment. His departure had been eradicated as an option by his repeated failed attempts to effectuate it. He got the job. Now the job has him. A trap, partially of his own making, is closing round him, holding him fast.
He is a monochromatic man. Dust is his color. It envelops every aspect of his person: hair, skin, eyes, clothing, softening all distinctions. The furrows in his otherwise unspoiled face suggest an outdoor life, weathered by the sun and wind, but his current pallor makes recent exposure to the elements unlikely. Welcome to the home of Charles Alexander Morgan, he says. I'm the caretaker. I'm here to be your guide. He pauses, and with a sigh, as if this next disclosure were more of a confession than a point of information, introduces himself by name. And so today, like yesterday, and like so many other yesterdays, that he has lost count and even forgotten when he lost it, he once more leads a steadily dwindling little band of visitors up the staircase he first climbed as an innocent applicant for a position that is now the very essence of his identity. He is the caretaker of the foundation, Dr. Morgan's man, a hired hand of sorts, so safely ensconced within his role that his capacity to excel at anything else has ceased to be a threat. He is here solely to make the dead man come alive. It has become a consuming preoccupation. His work is never done.
On the top floor lie the residential quarters of the house. This is where the private Dr. Morgan, driven to retreat before the growing demands for space and time of his perpetually expanding collection, the insatiable beast his wife had called it, to which the more he gave, the more it seemed to need of him, had taken refuge. This is where, since his death, in fulfillment of a promise made only to herself, his widow had staked out the territory for an installation of her own, preserving as sacred even the most mundane artifact of her late husband's existence. The public craves the personal touch, she had said years before, addressing the board in its early days in defense of her proposal. Much as we all appreciate the ambition and complexity of the doctor's great undertaking, we must admit it's all a little arcane for the ordinary person. What most people really want is some access to the private man. The effect of these upper rooms on their new selectively chosen audience confirms the widow's point. As the morning's 9 visitors moved to Dr. Morgan's study, painstakingly, though perhaps a bit too creatively restored in accordance with the widow's mandate to the condition which her husband had left it the day he departed on his final fatal journey, the look of strained puzzlement begins to seep from their faces. Unlike their recent experience on the floors below, where every marble they encountered represented one more challenge in a vast, imponderable mystery begging to be deciphered, the scene before them now is full of familiar stuff, evocative as a stage set.
In spite of, or because of, efforts to the contrary, Dr. Morgan's absence permeates the room. It emanates from the orphan chairs with their plump, uninflected seat cushions and empty arms, from the immaculate, dustless surfaces, the unlit lamps, unopened windows, unread books, from signs of order and disorder. Even the cultivated tokens of ordinary life are of no avail. The pair of well-worn velvet slippers, positioned neatly by the hearth, waiting in vain to welcome a familiar pair of tired feet. The uncapped fountain pen, abandoned by its writer, lying useless on a sheaf of papers, its ink dried up. The reading glasses, languishing beside an open dictionary, the half-smoked, recently extinguished Cuban cigar, its tip apparently still moist, resting in an ashtray, as if poised there, hoping to be reclaimed. These hapless clues bristle with false promises. Isn't it conceivable, they seem to be hinting in a sly whisper, that the former resident, now dead for more than a quarter of a century, might still be inhabiting his study as a persistent ghost, and having only just been called away unexpectedly, could return at any moment to retrieve his cigar and catch these trespassers in the act of violating his private sanctuary? Of course, the 9 trespassers in question happen to be rational, sophisticated people for the most part, unlikely to be troubled by subtle intimations of the supernatural. The vicissitudes of daily life has sharpened their need to detect the trick lurking behind every miracle. Skepticism is their god. And yet the past couple of hours, lingering under the spell of Dr. Morgan's museum, with its insistent demands on the imagination, has apparently undermined their usual capacity to dismiss, without question, the existence of certain unseen things, and left them abnormally vulnerable to the pleasures and terrors of illusion. All sorts of dubious possibilities begin to infiltrate the tidy certainties embedded in their minds.
The 9 people stand before him, penitents held captive not by the usual methods, locked doors or chains or prison bars or brandished weapons, but by the seductive power of their host's voice and by their own ambivalence, which keeps vacillating between fascination and revulsion at the unfolding spectacle. Once a group of disparate individuals separated by conflicting impulses, they have formed the instinctive, unspoken alliance of strangers confronted by a common threat. They're breathing in almost perfect unison. Suspicion has been growing in their midst, spreading its contagion from one to the next until it envelops them all. What if the mild-mannered guide they've been following through the house for the past hour or 2, whose instructions they have meekly been obeying and upon whose knowledge and wisdom they have relied, should in fact turn out to be one of those tragic madmen one encounters in lurid news reports, the sort of person whose whims it would be prudent for strangers to indulge.
Even as you stand there, smugly swaddled in your swaddlings, propping up your fictional personas with freshly blackened hair or reddened lips, or whatever transparent masquerade helps you to pass for who you think you were or hope to be, oblivion waits, smiling. Whatever made you think you could escape? Sooner or later we all wind up a pile of empty clothes and worthless keepsakes and sad, abandoned furniture. One last revenge on former friends and relatives, now burdened with mounds of stuff to defile, destroy, or auction off. That's the ultimate legacy. Whatever's left behind of you in everything you happen to have touched along the way. Everything on which you've inadvertently leached away bits of yourself in passing. Those flecks of dead skin, the stray hairs, the oily fingerprints, the sweat, the drool, the dried up blood and other fluids. That's what you'll inevitably become, and what you will, with any luck, remain, thanks to the impressionable objects you've come into contact with. Stone and wood and cloth and metal. Things with no agenda, no cause to plead, no interest in you other than to do what they can't help but do, to simply hold you and to keep you and preserve you in all the ferocious tenderness of their sublime indifference.
He manifests the peculiar fluency of someone who has honed his conversational skills without the benefit of anyone to talk to. substituting for the more ordinary forms of verbal intercourse extensive monologues conducted solely with himself, unimpeded by interruptions or contradictory opinions, or even so much as the implicit rebuttal on the face of a skeptical listener. Someone in the habit of embracing with equal fervor any side of a complex, vexing question as a kind of exercise to keep the mind alert and test its intellectual flexibility, pitting one adopted viewpoint against another in a contest which, given the perfect parity of the participants, can only achieve victory by arriving at a stalemate. Don't you even begin to get it yet, he says? This is what lies at the root of the doctor's reverence for the object, the unique, unadulterated particles of history embedded in each one of them, from the humblest paperclip or paper coffee cup to the rarest, irreplaceable treasure. Where else do you think history resides? Do you really think it's about something as ephemeral as words? Do you actually believe the stories they fill their heads with, those lies and mangled truths concocted in a futile effort to impose a reassuring pattern on the random by assembling disparate events into some arbitrary chronological chain of cause and consequence? Wake up, for God's sake. Look around you. Are you blind?
Eventually, in what may seem to the visitors like a lifetime, the caretaker, having extracted his price, permits them to escape.
Peace at last. Solitude. No one to answer to, no one to impress, charm, chastise, care for, enlighten, or entertain. No one, that is, at least until tomorrow. The caretaker enters the study and takes a seat at the desk. Hidden in plain sight, among the casually arrayed papers in front of him, is a large, unsealed, unaddressed manila envelope, from which he removes several sheets of pale blue monogrammed notepaper, yellowing slightly at the edges. The top sheet of paper is dated August 29th, 1987, and begins as follows. To my dear wife, to my loyal friends, faithful enemies, and whomever else it may concern. The caretaker takes up the reading glasses lying poised beside the open dictionary and, fitting them onto the bridge of his nose, waggles his head about as he adjusts to the sudden improvement in his vision. He reads on. The pernicious desire to take stock grows increasingly difficult to suppress. Birthdays will do that to a man sometimes, divert the healthiest of minds down a maze of philosophical blind alleys. Memories invade my dreams. Or is it the reverse? Ghosts point fingers. Here, abruptly, the writing ends. Suddenly, in a quick, decisive motion, he snatches up the letter, crumples it into a ball, and tosses it toward the middle of the room. This action reveals another, similar sheet of stationery, bearing the identical date. Many of the words are different. The gist, however, is the same.
My dearest Helen, you have never asked for explanations, and I owe you none. But in the end, whether this be this year, next year, or decades from now, one must eventually surrender the exhilarating burden of his secret life to the ravages of posthumous reputation. Looking back, which, as you know, I'm always loath to do, and assuming I have what's called a conscience, and that it happened to need clearing up, I could hazard the confessional mode and begin by saying I was responsible for as many as 3 deaths. That would of necessity include the suicide, although to presume to hold oneself accountable for such an independent, solitary act seems an unforgivable affront to the sublime autonomy of the perpetrator and is nothing but sheer megalomania. I suppose, for the ordinary person, questions of guilt might be expected to arise, but guilt is merely hubris in disguise and exists only to provide the impotent with some pathetic illusion of power, something to hide behind and beg forgiveness for, and in that way obtain permission to forget. No wonder adolescents wallow in it. But those of us who have befriended chaos and accept how little blame or credit we have any right to claim for what becomes of others, and maybe even of ourselves. Guilt is one of the many luxuries we need to have the courage to renounce.
Supporting the weight of his forehead with the thumb and forefinger of his right hand pressed against his temple, the caretaker is studying the page before him, as if hoping to lure from its remaining empty space the blessing of another sentence. History is my religion. I have given it my life, he writes. Then, with a single line through the middle of the 10 words, crosses it out and begins again. In the wake of any absence, nagging questions will naturally arise. A sudden void aches to be filled. Sooner or later, they will seek you out, the maggots we politely call the writers, the biographers, the critics, journalists, theorists, and historians, and whatever else they may purport to be, selectively amassing information in support of some predetermined point of view they have already sanctioned as the truth. Posterity is looming up ahead, ready to assume whatever shape it's given. You might ask why we should care, we non-believers, for whom the end of us might just as well constitute the end of everything. But vanity is made of hardy stuff. Still, the old, insatiable, helpless, homeless ego lingers on in the ether, guarding its exposed flanks against the impending facile summings up. Of course, as they will surely tell you, they only want to get the story right, but evil is the inevitable firstborn child of that sanctimonious monster known as good intentions, and I am no one's story. So let me be instead the rapist they are looking for, the murderer, the plagiarist, the thief, the fraud. Collaborate. Help them to explain me into non-existence. Help them to make me disappear. Save me by condemnation, obfuscation, misdirection. Lie about me, indict me, contradict me, libel me, defame me, slander me, stigmatize me. Save me from the consuming world. Let me be. Let falsehood be my shroud. In the end, the goal is silence. Alas, we may need words to get there.
The letter has consumed the better part of 5 pages. The writer pauses, then appends a valediction, followed by the symbolic flourish of a signature. Yours as always, in absentia, Charles. But this is not the last word. Apparently, there remains a postscript to be written. He observes, with the mild interest of a stranger, the movement of his left hand. He watches the pen he is holding form letters, and the letters assemble themselves into words. 2 words. Burn this, it says. And moments later, obedient as always, he does so.
This, by the way, this was the most exquisite thing for me. And thank you one and all. And you couldn't have been more perfect.
Thanks so much for that, everybody. Does anyone have any questions for Doon or for any of our speakers tonight?
First of all, thank you, everyone. It was beautiful to hear all the voices. And I want to thank you, Doon, for writing a book that I couldn't skim through and that I actually had to read each word. I'm a voracious reader, and I realized I hadn't done that in a while, so thank you. But something weird happened to me midway through the book where I started questioning whether the caretaker was actually the owner of the house.
Morgan.
Morgan. I just sort of started thinking, did I miss something? Was it really him and he hadn't died? You know, and I kind of knew I was just playing, my mind was playing tricks, but I'm curious whether that was ever something you wanted us to be tricked or fooled into thinking that.
I wasn't thinking about it. And in a way, I feel like the book is itself, and that question is there in the caretaker's mind, you know,
Right.
whether he's really more Dr. Morgan than Dr. Morgan was. But I don't know the answer any more than you do. And
I was trying to come up with a good question.
It was a great question. Thank you. I'm really baffled.
I have a question. It was so nice to hear everyone read, and I love the book, obviously, Doon. And I'd heard in another interview that you mentioned that the story really came out of a character that you had started writing in something else. And so I was wondering if you'd talk a little bit about that and how fully formed he was before he came into this story. And also maybe a little bit about your decision to keep him unnamed.
I'll take the last part first. I couldn't think of a name that seemed to suit, you know, and it seemed as if any name would solidify him in a way that would do injury to the whole story. And then it was so easy. And the only sort of little game was when he introduces himself by name and nobody gets the name. The rest of it, yes. So I was in the process of thinking about a big, ambitious book with many characters, and this one was only one of them. And as it turns out, in this book, he is nothing like the person that I thought was detaching themselves from the rest of the other book. He just took on his own everything. So now he doesn't really seem to have much relationship to what I was doing before, for which I thank him.
A question for Doon or for anyone else we have here tonight?
I have a question. The reading kind of moves from this kind of obsessive care for objects to an enormous investment in words. And I wonder whether you actually, at the end of the book, feel he's holding on to words but has to let go as well. And what do you think of this relationship between these curated objects that are so charged with memory in its absence, and then words which carry that, which is what we're doing here. We gave these words some life for the moment, but they will also disappear. But the relationship between objects and words, I think that kind of passed through all of us. And whether words can have that charge that is more than what they are.
You know what the
Yes.
help. You know what the answer to that is? The answer is yes. That was not difficult. But maybe there's something to be said about, well, you said something about things happening and then disappearing. And in a way, that's the nature of objects and what happens to them, and the nature of what words are and what happens to them. I mean, when I discovered the tape recorder, I'm going back in my ancient history, it was kind of a great thing, but it was also tragic because what I remembered was so powerful, of the exact little nuances of what people were saying. I had it all in my mind, or I believed I did, and there was no thing to prove me wrong. But as soon as I discovered the tape recorder, that was the end of that. You know, I put my mind to bed and relied on something that was supposedly wiser. And maybe that has a lot to do with current events, but I don't go there.
I guess I go next.
Yes.
Well, maybe mine's a little bit more mainstream pop, but in reading it, maybe this is not just a question for you, Doon, but for anyone. If it was optioned for a movie, who would you picture playing the caretaker? Because in my mind, I'm thinking...
Not Brad Pitt.
No, but I'm thinking like Ben Kingsley or Daniel Day-Lewis, or I don't know. I don't know if you had anything pictured in your mind, or.
I'd take Daniel Day-Lewis, but he's retired.
Oh, maybe not.
Hi, Dean. I told you I love your book. I was wondering, like, part of what I love so much about it are your ruminations, or the characters' ruminations on humanity and our behavior, and just the philosophy that seems embedded a lot in the ideas that you discuss in the book. And I was wondering if any of this originated in a nonfiction form, and or if there was nonfiction that inspired this in any way.
No. No, I didn't discover most of the things that are said in here till I wrote them, which I guess is a big plug for writing a book, which I don't mean it to be. No, that's one of the really terrific things. And then it's not you. And that's really important. And you get to have a whole relationship with it that is personal, but it's only personal the way a relationship between two people is personal, as opposed to the relationship that you have with yourself, which is very impersonal. I'm weird.
I'm sure a lot of people in the room know everybody on the panel, but I don't. I'd really like some way to introduce everybody.
That's what the program was for, so we could
But it's not like everybody's sitting in order, are they?
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
No.
Yes,
you
are.
Oh.
You are.
You are.
You are seated left to right.
It goes 1,
Yes,
2,
east to west.
3,
Yeah.
4.
Thank you.
Yes, you have it all. I mean, as much as they were willing to tell.
So I have a question. So this is asking you, Doon, not as the caretaker, but as the closest connection we have to the caretaker. The museum is predicated on the magnetism relationship between objects. It's about objects and the importance of objects. And in the course of the book, the caretaker treats a bunch of people appallingly, devastatingly, and takes from them objects, their treasured objects, and some of them wind up in the museum. So the people have been abused, they've been relieved of their objects. What's he up to? What's going on here?
He's desperate. He's had 24 years or so of what he felt was his whole point in life not being understood. And so these people, these poor people, have been chosen essentially arbitrarily because things happen. So suddenly he has a breaking point, I guess you could call it in parlance. And he feels that by taking something they care about, they may be enlightened. I mean, he's not me. I'm not taking anything.
Thank you.
Oh, I have something to say, which is that one reason why this script is structured this way to essentially end with the end of the letter or letters is because nobody said anything about the letters, and I was just astonished. They seem like, in a way, the core of the book. So I wanted to lay it on you all and say, huh?
I have a question. At some point, it's explained that he's been copying the journals precisely and exactly. And at that point, we understand that he has now kind of assumed the identity of Dr. Morgan and has lost, in fact, a sense of himself. And when he's writing those letters, it wasn't clear to me, and he's obviously channeling and incorporating various elements of this person's life and fulfilling the rest of the story somehow. But the timing for his actions, I wonder if that is triggered by the fact that Dr. Morgan was 66 and the caretaker is now that age or very nearly. Is there anything? It made me think he is fully channeling this whole life and repeating the end in some way of Dr. Morgan.
I mean, great. He's 1 year older.
Okay.
Yeah, and it says that somewhere. But other than that, I never thought of that. That's why there are readers.
Do we have time for one more question? Anyone?
If there's not one, I have one. But.
Sure.
Doon, I wanted to ask you about the title, about the caretaker, because it looms so large in who he is and the title of the book, and I'm just wondering how you decided that the centrality of that character, in relation to all the other parts about the ideas and language and everything, how you chose that as you were creating the book.
Oops, no. You need to know how to release it. He was always at the center, and I really tried hard to think of a title that wasn't The Caretaker, because, as you all must know,
Sure.
It's been not only taken well, but it's been taken badly and used many times. But I couldn't think of anything else that had those two things married to one another, care and taker, in such an exquisite way. And when the book came out in France, it was called Le Gardien. And the publisher, editor said to me, there is no word in French like the caretaker. Essentially apologizing.
Sure.
Because that was the best they could do.
What would it be in German? Anyone? Just seems like, that would.
We'll find out when we translate the book.
Okay.
The Germans won't apologize.
Any final questions?
Can I ask a second question?
Sure.
I actually wanted to continue what Neil was saying about how those poor people ended up having to leave their stuff.
Yeah.
That's why I was asking, if he switched identities, because at that point he's wearing Morgan's clothes. So to me, he wasn't taking from them. He was like collecting. I think that's when my mind started getting all confused. Like, he's now collecting for the museum.
Yeah.
And I was, and I just wanted to explain I wasn't crazy, but it was one of the points where I started thinking maybe it is him, because he's adding stuff to the museum, like a collector. So I just wanted to see what you thought of that.
I think you're absolutely right, but I think a lot of this is his own feeling of identifying with this person who isn't around to disabuse him of how similar they are. Yeah.
I guess I just want to tell you I enjoyed that whole end part.
That's so great.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. We are going to be doing a quick little reconfiguration of the space so Doon can sign just here. So pick up a copy of the book if you haven't already. If you do have a copy of the book, buy a copy for your friends. Buy multiple copies for multiple friends, and identify yourself to the bar staff downstairs so you can have some drinks. Thanks, everyone.
So the Last Supper is over now.